develop things on the web. At the start of the web, we had tags, right? We had form, we had select. We built our pages out of those tags, and they had meaning. They were encapsulated. They had some nice default UI. They were composable. And they'd inform the page whenever something interesting happened. Now, the way that we've been building pages on the web over the past couple of years is somewhat changed. We tend to stuff our pages full of CSS from frameworks like Bootstrap, or we fill our pages with plugins, JavaScript plugins, jQuery plugins. And so we end up in the situation where our pages are either bloated with CSS, bloated with JavaScript, or both. Now, what if the web platform was expressive enough to allow us to fill in the gaps in functionality where we don't have native tags for things with our own custom tags? Well, that's what web components are all about. That's what they're going to give us. And they're ushering in sort of this new renaissance. We call it the declarative renaissance, but it might as well be called the HTML renaissance. The unicorn breathing fire here is particularly important. But the idea is that we want to give you the power to be able to create your own elements and your own tags on the web. So the schedule for today looks a little bit like this. We're going to talk a little bit about web components. I'm going to talk about Polymer, a library that helps you build applications and sites using web components today. We're going to take a look at some examples. Hopefully, your mind will be blown by the end of the session. Otherwise, I'm expecting lots of looks of disapproval, one or the other, whatever works for you. Some quick information about me. I'm at Addy Osmani on Twitter. I work at Google as a software engineer on a few different projects, but I care a lot about web tooling and try to help people build applications a little bit better. You can feel free to check out that stuff a little bit later. Now, before we can actually understand where we're going, we have to go back in the past to understand where we've been. So let's picture going back in time for a moment. Boom, we're back in time. So this is google.com today. Let's go back in the past. This is google.com back in 1998, a slightly different time. Now, for anyone developing on the web back then, you're probably used to using something like this. Your pages probably looked similar. How many people here were actually developing for the web back in 1998? Great, I don't feel so old now. Now, because we're creative, our pages probably didn't look like this. They probably looked a little bit more like this. And your pages wouldn't be complete if you didn't have, a dancing baby with some fire in it. It's just common sense. Now, elements back then were the building blocks of the web. They were how we actually constructed our pages. And there are some interesting details about those elements that, we sometimes don't give them as much credit for. Those elements were encapsulated. So let's take, for example, the select tag. You drop it into your page, you give it some child options, and you get this nice default UI. I mean, you don't have to use any CSS to get this. You're not even touching JavaScript. You're just decoratively dropping these tags into the page and getting something back that's quite useful. We can go further with this. Elements are configurable. Here, I've got the same setup, but this is sort of like what happens at a conference when all of your t-shirts have run out. The only ones left are those double XLs. But in this case, I've just added the disable attribute to the children inside that element. And what I'm getting is a slightly different UI. It's disabled all the different items that are in that menu, and the only one that's actually visible and selected is my double XL. Again, didn't have to touch any JavaScript in order to get this. Here's another example. I drop in the multiple attribute into this, and it takes, the UI takes on completely different meaning. Here, I'm now able to select sort of multiple items inside this page. And again, I'm getting a different UI, didn't have to touch any script or style sheets in order to get this in place. It's actually quite powerful. Elements are composable. So here, rather than just dropping in options, I've dropped in an opt group. And what this has given me is a slightly more complex piece of UI. Remember, it's the exact same element. It's just been able to understand that by combining some other elements inside of it, you're trying to express a slightly different meaning to what you're building. And again, not having to necessarily touch script in order to get this in place. We can place the select in a form, takes on a different meaning. We're now in a context where we actually want to submit some data back to a server for processing. And elements are programmable. And we're not just talking about markup. I can actually go into JavaScript, and if I want to, say, set the selected item or configure that element, I can do it using script. Because these elements had a really nice, rich DOM-based API. Good design doesn't date, and good element design doesn't date either. So what happened? Where did things start to go a little bit wrong? Well, let's think about tabs. So tabs are a pretty quintessential component on the web. We've all built tabs before, right? Now, how do we build tabs today? Well, a few years ago, we probably started out with quite a lot of markup in there. We probably used a jQuery plugin or something similar to initialize a part of the page as a tab component. And that sort of made sense. But over the past few years, we've started moving more and more and more and more of our markup, our logic, directly into JavaScript. This is actually XJS, where almost all of the functionality is being configured inside JavaScript instead of our markup. This is a little bit weird, because we're piling on the JavaScript for our UI. And we end up with this. So this is Gmail, right? This is Gmail. This is what the source to Gmail looks like. I have no idea what any of this means. This would drive me to be an alcoholic if I had to read this every day. Now I know that, I know the Gmail team. I know this was built in this way for a particular reason, but I miss the expressiveness of the web. I miss being able to read through source and not just see div soup. So is there any way that we can do this better? Design isn't just how something looks, isn't just how a UI component looks, it's how it works. What if we could just do this on the platform in order to get some tabs? This is X tabs, right? I can read this in the page, and I can clearly see, okay, well, this person is trying to build a tab component. Any of the child items that are inside there represent a new tab. And I could take this further. I could say, okay, well, if I add the selected attribute on one of these children, maybe that means that that's the selected tab. It's a lot more meaningful than what we have today. Now, the way that we are going to start enabling you to create your own custom tags on the web are through a set of specifications known as web components. They're sort of an emerging set of standards, and they're composed of these four things. So we've got templates, custom elements, shadow DOM, and HTML imports. So let's go through this list. Where templating on the web is something that I think most of the people in this room have probably touched at some point. We're talking about JavaScript templating in particular, or server-side templating, where you're going to have some markup on the page. You want to be able to say, well, maybe this is inert. Maybe I don't necessarily need this just yet, but I'd like to use this. Maybe in an iterator to output like the same template for gallery or something like that. Well, the template tag is a new thing to the platform that allows us to do that without necessarily needing to use like a JavaScript templating library. So it's baked in. That's an example of a piece of functionality we've seen developers and designers use long enough that we think it's important enough to bake into the platform. Custom elements. Custom elements give you the ability to create your own tags on the web. They can be anything you want. You can namespace them with your name. You can namespace them with your company's name. But they allow you to extend HTML's vocabulary with your own. Shadow DOM sits on the back of all of this. So for a long time, we've had a problem with encapsulation on the web. Whenever we wanted to encapsulate something so it wouldn't leak into the rest of the page, we've used iframes and tons of hacks around it. Shadow DOM finally allows us to get more control over encapsulation in our pages. So you can encapsulate CSS, your styles, your DOM, and make sure that it doesn't leak into the rest of the page. And HTML imports are a really nice extra feature on top of this. So for the longest time, we've been able to do things like say, well, I have a file that represents some styles. I'd like to import that into my page. Or, I have a script I'd like to include in my page. But we haven't had that for HTML. Imports allow us to package together markup, CSS, and JavaScript in a single file, and include them in our pages for reuse. So here are some examples of web components and things that you could build. You could bring back the blink tag if you wanted. It's a quintessential thing. You need this, and not enough people using the blink tag today. We could introduce our own charting components. Now, what's different between this and what you're probably already using? Well, let's actually pop open View Source and take a look. Well, here I have a chart py tag. And inside this tag, let me bump this up a little bit. Inside this tag, you'll see I'm just configuring these charts using nothing more than attributes. So the same way that you go and you configure the select element, you can use that same system, that same API, for contributing these elements. And you can extend that API, that attribute-based API, as much as you want. Next example. So someone in the community actually thought, well, you know, the GIF tag is something that could be extended to be a little bit better than what we have today. So we already use something, you know, we already use the GIF tag for like animated GIFs, animations in the page. What if you could actually control the way that the animation is running? What if you could set sort of styles for how it's animating? Or you could control the speed of the animation, because you're going and you're extending what the platform already gives you with your own custom functionality. Or what if you could go and, you know, let's say that you managed to get some of the beat information for a piece of audio, and you wanted to synchronize your animation up to that. Well, XGIF actually allows you to do that. So here, this is a piece of music from Tron, and it's actually synchronized up to the movement inside this GIF because we've got beat information. This is something that the current GIF tag doesn't actually let you do. But the ability to go and extend what we currently have with your own functionality allows you to do this. What if we could take existing pieces of the web and make them a little bit more pleasant to use? So like start thinking big, like what can you re-envision? One thing that I've always had trouble with is actually using, so there's an API called Get User Media for like being able to access your webcam and different camera devices on your system. I always end up having to look up the syntax for it because I'm not entirely sure how it works. But what I do know is if there was a tag available, like a video camera tag, I could easily go and drop that into my page. Hello. But this is basically just a simple tag inside here. Look. So this is just, I'm saying video is video camera, using some attributes to configure it, and that's it. All you need to do to be able to capture images inside your page is just drop this tag on there. You can go a little bit more crazy. So I thought wouldn't it be interesting to create like a Miley Cyrus tag as well, just because. And because tags can have like hidden functionality in them as well, you can sort of like roll over this.
I came in like a
This is what the web was made for. Now, because we're in Canada, and you guys decided to give the world Justin Bieber, I thought we kind of need to have a Flapping Bieber game as well, right? And this game is currently broken, it seems. Whenever I'm having problems with CSS and vertical centering, I go in there and enjoy exploding Justin Bieber. Thank you for Justin Bieber. So on a slightly more serious note, let's talk about composability for a moment. So I talked about tabs earlier. Here's a little web component that gave me tabs. Let's say that somebody else in this room wanted to go and start building like a mobile web app that reused these tabs for some other functionality. Maybe you wanted to create like a tabbed interface. Well, you can just go and instead of having to re-implement this functionality yourself, you can extend a tag that someone else has built to reuse this. So this is like a tabbed content. I just drop this in my page. I can define like content for the individual items that get displayed when I select a different tab. I can take this further. I could go and if I wanted to create a carousel component, if you think about it in terms of components, tabs and a carousel are actually quite similar. What I'm doing here is I'm tabbing through some dots, right? I'm not really doing anything that's much different from the tab component we saw on the other page, but I'm able to create a component using composability, just extending other people's work rather than going and reinventing the wheel. What if, you know, to use APIs to drop data into your pages, you just used a tag? So let's say that like YouTube gave you some tags to drop into your pages, and you could use those to go and build applications. I just include this in my page, I pass a query to it, and it's gone and it's fetched this data from the API. I didn't even need to go and configure this. So web components give us some interesting ways to improve the way that we do things today. You could similarly apply this concept to things like authentication. Like as a designer or a prototyper or a developer, like what if you wanted to integrate with a third-party service? Well, here, this is integrating with Google Sign-In. And all I'm doing is dropping the page into this tag, configuring it, and I can then go and start accessing Google's different APIs and display data. I also created like a slideshow component called Reasons Kids Cry. It's like one of my favorite things to pick me up. He can't find his rubber ducky. We took her to a Justin Bieber concert. He met Bill Murray. And you can go further. One of the things that I always love doing with the audio tag is going and building additional pieces of functionality on top of it for like visualization. The visualizations are actually kind of hard to do. What if I could go and build something that looks a little bit like this? And all I had to do in order to configure it was this. I'm using a tribute-based API. I'm passing in a source to the song that I want played, and it's taking care of the rest behind the scenes. John Lee Miller and Orbital are probably responsible for most of my career, so thank you, hackers. So you've taken a look at some web components. Let's take a look at how you actually go about building them. So what we're used to using today to include widgets and plugins on our pages is something a little bit like this. You'll probably drop in a style sheet, maybe a widget for your JavaScript. Maybe you'll initialize it using data attributes, maybe some jQuery UI factory stuff. Maybe you'll dynamically set it using inner HTML. But using a custom element is actually pretty straightforward. For a widget to be included on a page, you just use HTML imports, which look a little bit like style sheets. So in this case, I'm just saying link rel equals import, href equals the location of the thing that I'd like to include on the page, and that's it. I can then go and start using that tag anywhere that I want to inside the page, and it'll just work. I can configure the attributes in the same way that I showed you earlier. And it's quite pleasant to use. What about creating custom elements? Well, I apologize for that being out of focus. To create a custom element, use a new method called register element. So document.register element. In this case, I'm creating my dash element just by calling document.register element. I can then go start using it inside my page right away. What about extending existing components? So things like, maybe the button tag or the video tag. Well, you can do that as well. So in this case, I'm creating a new mega button by extending the prototype of the HTML button element. And then I can go and I can give it whatever custom functionality that I want. If you want to take a look at what you can do with this, so this is like the normal button element before it's been extended. And it's going to extend it when I roll over. So that's extended it. I'm slowly breaking the web one day at a time. You can also get callbacks. So remember when I said that selects and all those nice HTML elements from back in the day would let the page know when something interesting happened? So you also get these nice little callbacks as part of web components and custom elements. So here, as soon as your element's created callback gets called. If you have an attribute, so maybe name or width or something like that, and that gets changed by the user, either inside the page or dynamically, it'll go and trigger this callback for you. Now, that can look something like this. So this is a Pokemon web component, and what it's currently doing is it's going to go and update the image if it notices that I've changed the name attribute on here. So let's go and change this to something like Charmander. So I've gone and I've changed that. And it's instantly updated my UI. So I'm using those attribute callbacks to actually do something useful. What about styling? So styling is really important because we want to be able to give you control over everything in the page. So because you're creating your own new tags, you're able to use like this syntax, so in this case xfoo or my tabs to go and style things. You get access to selectors for styling things that are inside those elements as well. So you've got a fairly good amount of customization capabilities there. You also get access to a new little primitive called unresolved. So custom elements, think about them in terms of like something that goes and upgrades the existing elements that are on the page. It's this new great world of web components. Well, there might be a little bit of a delay in the browser actually upgrading that element. And if your element is like particularly heavy, it's got like a lot of stuff in there, you might want to be able to control like what the user sees, whether it's a progress bar or something else. Well, unresolved allows you to actually go and style that. So you can style what the component looks like before it's completely finished initializing. It's a nice little thing to be able to avoid things like found on the page. Shadow DOM, so being able to go and set styles. So in this case, a shadow host, these terms are going to sound a little bit technical, but well, bear with me. So a shadow host can be thought of as the element you've created itself. And then you have concepts like shadow root, which is something that gets rendered to the rest of the page. And you can control what actually gets injected inside there. So in this case, I'm manually overriding what's going to be displayed to the user so that I can say, okay, well, the style of my span is going to be green. Here's a slightly more complex example where I have an element which contains a message, so it's got sort of the ID equals message. And then the outside of my page has also got the same selector being used to style anything with the ID message. But what you'll notice is that inside the element, message is purple because I've overridden it inside the scope of the element itself. But outside, it's blue. So that encapsulation is working for you right away. It can be particularly useful if you're like creating widgets and little applications you want other people to include in your pages. Now, web components are awesome. They're getting great support in Chrome. We're hoping to have support for all of this stuff, hopefully in the next few months. Firefox is looking pretty good as well. But cross-browser support isn't fully there just yet. And so we started this project called Polymer to try helping you with this. So Polymer is a library that allows you to use web components today in modern evergreen browsers. And it allows you to go and create your own custom elements, use Shadow DOM to a level, use HTML imports. It's quite useful. And Polymer includes a few different things. So let's talk about it in terms of layers. So at the very bottom in gray, you have native. So if a browser natively supports web components and those 4 core technologies I talked about, it'll just defer to the native implementation. If you're using something that's slightly older and it perhaps doesn't include that stuff just yet, we then have a platform layer in Polymer. And that's basically a polyfill layer that will polyfill in all of these different features so that you can use them today. So if you're using Firefox with Polymer and you want to be able to use web components today, you can do that. We'll polyfill in all those other features for you. We then have Polymer, which is like an opinionated way to work with web components. And finally, we have like elements, so a set of elements that people can use to go and build things themselves. So there are 3 ways to work with Polymer. There's using elements, there's creating elements, and there's utilizing the modern web platform if you want to go and build things yourself. So let's take a look at the blue layer, so using elements. So in the Polymer world, we like to take this idea of being able to go and create your own elements to sort of an extreme. We like to think, well, what if everything in your application or in your site was an element? Well, here's a set of Polymer UI elements. We've got sort of UI elements for things like cards. So if you're building a mobile application where you want to be able to use cards, you just include a card element in your page and configure the content for it. We've got accordions, so you just include content inside of the tag and it will go and automatically configure the accordion for you. And in this case, so this is the accordion again, but the accordion itself is composed of smaller pieces. So here we have a collapsible element that basically forms up that accordion. Any content you put inside of it can expand and collapse as needed. And then we've got sort of utility elements. Now, utility elements are things which are not strictly visual. And this is sort of something that blows people's minds and also gets them a little confused sometimes. But again, bear with me. So what if we could actually smooth over some of the things that we try to use, some of the APIs we try to use on the web today? What if something like local storage was actually implemented as a tag you could just drop into your page? Because if you think about it, when you're using local storage and you're trying to persist data to the browser, you're usually just binding some data in your interface that you just want to be available when the page loads up. So in this case, I can enter in a string like FITC and toggle this. And when I reload the page, you'll see that that string is instantly repopulated via this tag. It's quite useful. Something like Flexbox. Flexbox is fantastic, great for configuring your layouts, but a little bit difficult to understand sometimes. So we created a Flex. Sorry. Maple syrup? Okay, great. We're back. I'm sorry. There are very few places I get to say that. All right. So this is a flexbox element. Imagine being able to place content into this tag and have it automatically configure out like the flex layout for you. So in this case, I've currently got it displaying like rows for this different content. I go and I toggle vertical to horizontal, and instantly it'll go and readapt the layout for me to display this in columns instead. Now you could imagine using something like this to create slightly more complex layouts for yourself. And you can go and you can configure like individual pieces of this too, in case you wanted to sort of trigger how wide this area is. Something else that's interesting, what if we could abstract away Ajax into its own tag? Crazy, right? Like, why would you do that? But it's actually kind of interesting. Like, if you think about why we go and we use Ajax, usually it's to go and query some third-party service for data. We usually send them some parameters, like what we want, and then we respond to that information somehow. So in this case, what I have is a tag where I'm just saying, okay, well, here's the endpoint. Here's like the YouTube data service for feeds that I want to access. Just passing in some parameters. And when I go click run, it goes and it just fetches the data into my page for me. Like I could easily just drop this tag into a page and go querying off as many services as I want. Something else, so responsive design, how does that apply to web components? Well, you could imagine individual elements that you drop into your pages being able to adapt to their own layout, or perhaps having the parent element adapt to their layout. I was going to show you this, this really awesome demo, which is pretty much just text and is incredibly sexy, but I thought maybe I'd build something better. So what if we went and we polyfilled something like the picture element using this stuff? So this is Mona Lisa. So let's imagine we're on a fast retina display where we're okay displaying high resolution images. We got that, right? But if we happen to be on a slightly smaller screen, we get art direction, right? So here, as per any mobile experience, this gets progressively worse as your viewport changes. But you get the ability to configure that as much as you want. Now, how many people here are designers? Right? We've got some designers in here. Great. So we thought, well, this stuff is great, but in order to understand how the syntax works, you kind of need to, in some cases, be a developer. Let's see if this actually works. Okay. Video for this is not working, which is great. Totally expected. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm just going to navigate to the file, and we're going to pretend that that's what I intended to do in the first place. Right. So we built this this designer application that basically allows you to go and visualize all the different elements that you might have in your catalog and your company's catalog. In this case, I can actually go and pretty rapidly build out an application. So here I'm dropping sort of a nice little skeleton for a new application I'm creating. I'm going and I'm setting some style information around it. Just going and saying, okay, well maybe I'd like to change the title of this application. And then I want to be able to actually input something into this. So let's say that this is going to be like an I'm feeling lucky YouTube app. So I drop another element, an input element into this page, automatically adapts to the right position and snaps. I can then go and customize this a little bit. So just setting the styling once again. I go back to my components, and we've actually abstracted away being able to use the YouTube API into its own element here. So once again, we just go inside, apply a little bit of styling to it, so just trying to make it fit neatly into there. It should be good. Now, if you go and you click on that YouTube element, we actually expose all the different attributes that can be used to configure it directly inside here. So I see that there's an attribute called I'm feeling lucky. And I can actually go and select my input element, and I can actually set what attribute I'd like to bind my interface to. So now, all I need to do is just go and type in a query, and it'll automatically update that.
It gets better test. Ben, if you don't chew with your mouth closed, I'm gonna take the Nutri-Green bar away. Drink up.
I apologize. Apologize profusely for many things. Salesforce.com have actually recently started using the Polymer Designer. And what they did is they went and they implemented all the different UI components that their front-end teams are working on as Polymer elements. And they now have access to this UI where they can just go and drag and drop different elements. Because they use like a common attribute-based API, you can interact with them and respond to change. And they're using this to build out prototypes. So I can actually picture a world where lots of people have their own designer catalogs and they're using this to build up applications. And the code that's output by this is actually pretty usable. You can go and start creating proper elements off the back of it. So we then have creating elements. How am I for time? 10 minutes? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the API that you get using Polymer. So if you're trying to go and write your own web components, your own custom element using the native features that you get, they're actually really powerful, but they do include an amount of boilerplate that gets a little bit tiresome to use. So we thought, well, wouldn't it be cool if we could abstract some of that away? So this is creating your own custom element using Polymer. I'm just saying, well, Polymer element, define the name, and because I'm not actually going to interact with any JavaScript in this particular case, I just specify the noScript attribute. And I can then go and include any content that I want inside here. Now, you might be wondering what this template tag is doing. Well, what Polymer does is if you use the template tag inside there, we actually automatically turn anything inside the first template into Shadow DOM. So it gets automatically encapsulated for you. We can take this a little bit further. So you can, in this case, where we are using script, we're using the Polymer method to go and just configure this element with its own API. So we now have the say hello method available, and it's automatically getting called when the element goes and gets rendered. We also have support for binding expressions. So in this case, you're probably aware of, like, again, JavaScript templating, things like handlebar syntax or much test syntax. In this case, we actually have access to very similar syntax to go and dynamically populate content based on the different variables or attributes that we have inside our element. So here I'm just saying, okay, well, I'd like you to populate the sentence with whatever the current owner is. And as you can see, it's working as soon as I've got my element initialized. Publish properties. So being able to allow anybody that's using your own elements to override default functionality. So here, this is how we go and define our own custom API using HTML attributes for other people. So in this case, just by defining attributes equals owner, I can go and I can override the default value of this. So it can say that Alex built the component instead. I think I've got another example here. Oh, great. All right, so in this case, this is just an example of how published properties can interact with each other. So we've actually got two elements on this page. We've got the selector element, and we've got the sort of meme element. And in this case, I can go and I can actually select something like Canada in this case. It'll automatically detect that I've gone and changed the attribute, and other elements will go and then start reacting to it. So in this case, I don't know, I'm terrible with this stuff. Or something, I don't know. Declarative event handlers. So many, many years ago, we all seemed to decide that using things like the on-click was a terrible idea. We're rethinking that position now when it comes to web components. Not all ideas are terrible. They've been discounted before. In this case, this is actually, again, quite useful to use. So here I've got like another custom element. And I can specify on click, on tap, on swipe, on key press, any of those events. And when you go and you trigger that action, it can actually go and execute any behavior that you've defined inside of your private or public APIs. So here I can go and click this element, and it will just say, okay, well I was clicked. Automatic node finding. This is like a really complicated term for something that's quite simple. So how many people here use jQuery? Use jQuery? Everybody, right? Everybody's used it. We thought, well, jQuery's got this really nice API for interacting with the DOM. What if we could come up with something similar for working with web components? So in this case, what I've got is I've got a focus element, and inside of my API, so inside of this little block here, I'd actually like to be able to access name input. As you can see, name input has got an ID of name input, and to access it, all I do is this $.name input. I don't need to touch query selector all. I don't need to touch jQuery. I can just use this, and it's baked in to Polymer. So in this case, I just click set focus, and it goes and it focuses the element. And the question that we get asked a lot is, what about accessibility? You know, it's great that people are able to go and create their own custom tags on the web, but doesn't that mean that we automatically lose all of that nice baked-in goodness when it comes to things like ARIA and keyboard support? I have this sort of checklist that I keep in the back of my mind whenever it comes to how we make sure that things are accessible. Do all of your elements have meaningful text alternatives? Can all functions be reached via the keyboard? You'd be surprised how much of the web isn't accessible via the keyboard. It's kind of crazy. Do you have a sensible focus order? So people that have to use screen readers actually rely on being able to correctly tab around the rest of the page. And if you don't have the tab index correctly set up, they can find that a little bit difficult. Are your elements marked up to be accessible? So using things like ARIA. Can users understand everything without relying on a color? Like that's kind of crazy, right? Actually having to think about contrast ratio and how the elements that you're sticking on different people's pages might cause someone to not be able to interact with your content. This is sort of an example of how you could make a Polymer element a little bit more accessible. So we have sort of on key down handlers, on key press handlers. I can specify different roles. So in this case, this is a ratings component. I can specify different roles here. Even inside my template, I can actually specify ARIA roles if I want it. And this is like a very good demo of this. So I can actually tab in to this page. And without necessarily using my mouse, I'm just using my keyboard, I can actually interact with this component. I can increment and decrement this star rating. There's a really great extension for Chrome you can get called the Chrome Accessibility Tools, or the Accessibility Dev Tools. And they actually now have support for web components and shadow DOM. So even if you're building your own custom elements using this new technology, it'll actually help you find accessibility issues that you can go and then try to improve. And let's mention the platform a little. So the platform in Polymer is that layer of polyfills that helps you get a better browser just by including it inside your page. And it tries to give you these things. Now, the current state of things like the template tag, so template tag is currently available in most evergreen browsers, which is fantastic. Imports will probably be coming to Chrome in the next 2 versions. I think Firefox haven't said when they're going to implement imports just yet. The custom elements and shadow DOM they're working on. I think that this is actually really good news, even though it doesn't sound fantastic. So I have expressed interest. Seriously, years ago we couldn't even get them to say that. So I'm really happy that they expressed interest. It could happen. I'm hopeful that one day, maybe a couple of years from now, we'll be in a situation where everyone has natively got this stuff implemented. And the really big benefit there is going to be speed improvements. So rather than us having to polyfill a lot behind the scenes, just being able to rely on the native implementations. Now, some of the other things we're working on in the background with Polymer are trying to improve the way that people build things like animations on the web. There's a whole set of standards around web animations currently being worked on. Hopefully, by the time we're finished, you'll have access to things like, so you probably know like the jQuery like animate method, right? We're actually working on trying to bake things like that into the platform. So you can just use them with like keyframe animations to go and script your own animations. It's actually pretty cool. Our hope is that as other browsers go and implement these specifications, that layer, that platform layer can disappear, and Polymer itself will just keep getting smaller and smaller as time goes on. We've got a few different pieces of tooling that you can use. We've got Yeoman generators for Polymer elements. You can use Bower to install different elements. We've got this nice little boilerplate that we recently set up that will actually, so you use this to go and create your own reusable element. I'll link it up for you later. But if you use our boilerplate, we actually wrote an element that can scrape all of your code and automatically generate you documentation and a landing page off the back of that. Which is something that we didn't really get that with the jQuery plugin ecosystem. But with this, you get a nice landing page. It encourages you to actually tell your users about your API, which is it's kind of neat. Another question we often get asked is, I'm going to have to skip back here very quickly. So another question we get asked often is, where can people actually go and find web components written by the community? So we set up this site called customelements.io. And this is a site where anybody can go and they can write their own custom element, they can go and they can submit it, and other people can go and start installing it, playing around with it, checking out demos. And our hope is that eventually we'll be in a position where everybody, not just like browser vendors, but everybody in the community are going and they're writing their own elements. We're building on everybody else's work. So do check out customelements.io. It's a pretty neat site. It's a good place to find out what other people are currently building. For more information on Polymer, please check out polymer-project.org. Where there's collaboration, great things can happen. I'm hopeful that in a couple of years' time, rather than us as a community, re-implementing like 1 billion different Lightbox components, we can just rely on like 1 or 2 really high-quality elements and have everyone just go and build like that thin layer of additional functionality you need on top of it. We can do the same thing with all of our other UI elements. So hopefully you're excited about this stuff. I know it's still early days, but I do encourage you to go and check out Polymer, check out web components. Please help us componentize the web. We need your help. Build elements. Your friends are going to all be like this. This is, be totally in on. But I hope this has been useful. Thank you. Do we have any time left? We've got a few minutes. Does anybody have any questions? We've got questions, okay.
How do you do any kind of data output from these? You mentioned using APIs to the tags. Is it typically done through callbacks, or does it expose attributes that you can then use in the content of the tag?
It's completely up to the author to define how they'd like that to work, but all the things you mentioned are actually possible. So you can use attributes to pass data around and how it gets output. You can use Ajax to pull in that data. Some people have gone and created web components where they're just like outputting the data that's inside of that directly on the server side and then including it in your pages. So there's a few different options for how that can be done.
Okay, thanks.
So with the new tags for like embedding elements in the shadow doc to replace iframes, how do you deal with, I guess, like attacks, either like phishing sites or like injecting malicious script into your website?
We actually are able to do a level of XSS checking against that for you, and you can still use existing sort of XSS linting tools on top of that. But it's really something that we're trying to work. So one of the interesting things about Polymer is that this is the first time that the Chrome team is actually building a framework. And whenever we find that there are areas like XSS, for example, that are possible inside the framework, we can work in tandem with the Chrome team to figure out, well, is this something that we can patch directly inside of the browser? So it's an interesting thing that we're working on. Any other questions? Sure, go ahead.
I saw a lot of parallels with Angular in terms of like binding, just handling custom elements, like HTML elements. Was there any inspiration from the Angular team, or was this in production a long time ago?
So the initial work on the web component specs started about 3 or 4 years ago. I would say that it's very likely that there was some crossover of ideas. In terms of like where we see the projects going, so Angular is great. It's got a really fantastic ecosystem around it. I love the project. Polymer is sort of future-facing, and we're trying to make sure that we're using sort of the fastest primitives that are available inside the browser. But one of the things that the Angular team recently announced was that they're looking to use Polymer and sort of web components for all of their UI widgets. And so I can see a world where like there are multiple different frameworks that offer you different ways of being opinionated about how you structure applications, but we still defer to web components for more sort of the encapsulation and custom tag functionality. Any other questions down there?
Yeah. Can these widgets that are encapsulated access anything in the regular DOM? Anything outside of it?
Well, the idea is that the idea is that it's supposed to be completely encapsulated. If you do require like the ability to pass data between different elements, any element can actually fire off an event with additional data inside it, and any other element can listen out for that data. So you have like a way to do message passing. 0 minutes. Okay, please feel free to grab me later if you have any other questions. Thank you once again. It's okay.
I'm handing it to you.